The rope was already around her wrists when Seorin realized her mother was smiling. Not crying, not looking away. Smiling, the small, satisfied curve of a woman watching a debt finally get paid. Snow fell over the execution grounds of the Beak estate, soft and white, as if the sky itself hadn't heard what was about to happen. Seorin knelt in the mud in a servant's gray robe, the silk gowns of a clan heir stripped from her the night before. Somewhere behind the crowd, her half-sister wept into a handkerchief for an audience that would remember the tears and forget the lie. And in the front row, wrapped in furs, sat the woman who had carried her, fed her, taught her to bow to a family that had never once loved her back, watching her daughter kneel in the snow and smiling. "Any last words?" the executioner asked, almost bored. Seorin lifted her head. She found her mother's eyes one final time, and in them she saw no grief, no doubt, only relief, the relief of a woman who had traded her daughter's life for her own comfort and slept easily doing it. "Yes," Seorin said quietly. "Tell my mother I finally understand her, and tell her I will remember." The blade came down with the snow still falling, and somewhere far beneath the earth something old and patient finally opened its eyes. 3 years earlier, Seorin had learned the first rule of the Beak household before she learned to read. A smile that reaches your mother's mouth does not always reach her eyes. She was 6 years old the day she understood what she was. It was raining, the kind of gray mountain rain that turned the courtyard to mud, and she had run inside soaked to the bone, laughing, holding out a fistful of wild plum blossoms for her mother. Lady Myra had looked at the flowers, then at her daughter's dripping hair and said only, "You'll track mud through the hall, go to the kitchens." Not unkind, not cruel. Simply indifferent, the way one might speak to a servant's child, which in every way that mattered inside these walls Seorin was. Lady Myra had once been a maid in this house, before Lord Beak Junho, drunk on wine and grief the year his first wife miscarried, had taken her to his bed and never spoken of it again. Seorin was the daughter of that single, humiliating night, proof, walking and breathing, of the lowest moment of her mother's life. Lady Myra had clawed her way from servants' quarters to a modest side residence through sheer cunning, marrying respectability with careful smiles and longer silences. But she never forgot what her daughter's face reminded the household of. And so Seorin grew up fed, clothed, educated just enough to be useful and loved by absolutely no one, except perhaps by older Nan. Nan was the one servant who braided Seorin's hair without being told to, who slipped her the good rice when the kitchen ran short, who told her in a whisper by candlelight, "Your blood is Beak blood too, child. One day this house will have no choice but to see it." Seorin used to think Nan was just being kind. She didn't yet know that kindness, in a place like this, was the rarest and most dangerous currency of all. The legitimate daughter of the house, Suah, was 2 years older, golden-haired in the way only the clan's true bloodline was said to carry, adored by every tutor and guard and elder who passed through the gates. Suah was not cruel to Seorin, not exactly, she simply looked through her, the way one looks through a window at bad weather, acknowledging it exists without letting it touch her. Everything changed on Seorin's 14th birthday, the night of the blood flame trial. Once every generation, the Beak clan tested its children before the ancestral flame said to have chosen their bloodline 500 years ago, a fire that recognized true Beak blood and rejected all else. It was tradition, formality. Everyone already knew Suah would be confirmed as heir. Seorin was brought forward only because refusing to present an acknowledged child, however illegitimate, before the flame was considered an insult to the ancestors. She remembered the elders' bored faces as she stepped up to the brazier. She remembered Lady Myra's hand tightening on her fan, not from hope, but from the fear of embarrassment. She remembered pressing her palm to the ancient stone as she'd been instructed, and then the fire turned gold. Not the pale orange it had shown for every child before her, including Suah 2 years prior. Gold, then white, then a color that had no name, roaring up in a column that made every elder in the hall drop to their knees. The oldest priest, a man of 80 who had overseen 4 blood flame trials, wept openly and said words Seorin would never forget. "The flame has not chosen a Beak this brightly in 300 years. For one single glowing moment, Seorin was not the daughter nobody wanted. She was the miracle nobody had expected. She should have known that a miracle in a house built on appearances is not a blessing. It is a threat to everyone who was comfortable before it arrived. Lady Myra did not embrace her that night. She did not smile with pride. She stood very still at the edge of the hall, and when Seorin finally found her in the crowd, her mother's face wore an expression Seorin had never seen before and would spend the rest of her short life trying to understand. It was fear. Here is the lesson the world does not teach you gently. Those closest to you are not always frightened for you. Sometimes they are frightened of what your rising means for them. Seorin didn't understand that yet, not fully. She was 14, and dazzled and desperate for the one thing she'd never had, which was to matter. She ran to her mother that night with her whole chest full of hope, certain that finally she'd done something worthy of love. "Mother," she whispered, "did you see? The flame chose me." Lady Myra looked down at her daughter for a long moment, then she reached out and for the first time in Seorin's memory touched her cheek gently. "Yes," she said softly, "I saw." Seorin would spend her final night alive trying to remember whether that touch had been affection, or the first careful stroke of a woman beginning to measure her daughter for a coffin. Power, Seorin discovered, rearranges a room the instant it enters. Within a season of the blood flame trial, everything shifted. Tutors who had once taught her grudgingly now competed for the honor. The head elder began greeting her with a small bow. Lord Baek Junho, who had acknowledged her existence perhaps a dozen times in 14 years, summoned her to his study and in his stiff, formal way, told her she would be moved to the main residence. "The bloodline chose you," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "It would be an insult to the ancestors to let you live among the servants any longer." It wasn't love. Seorin understood that even then. But it was the closest thing to acknowledgement she had ever received from the man who fathered her, and she clung to it the way a starving person clings to bread, regardless of who baked it or why. The greatest change came in the form of a name she'd only ever heard in stories. Crown Prince Taeyong of the Eastern Court, third son of the reigning king, renowned across the peninsula for a mind sharper than his sword, and his sword, by every account, was already legendary. When word of the Blood Flame's judgment reached the royal court, the Crown Prince himself requested an audience with the miracle daughter of Clan Baek. Seorin remembered standing in the receiving hall in a borrowed silk gown 2 sizes too fine for her, certain she would say something foolish and shame the entire household. Instead, Prince Taeyong had walked in, looked at her with an unreadable, searching expression, and asked the last question she expected. "Do they treat you kindly here, Lady Seorin? Not is the flame's judgment accurate. Not prove your power." He asked if she was treated kindly, as though her well-being, not her usefulness, was the thing worth knowing first. She hadn't known how to answer honestly, so she'd said something diplomatic and empty, but his eyes had lingered on her a moment too long, as if he'd heard the truth underneath the polite lie anyway. Within a month, a formal engagement was proposed. Within 2, it was accepted. Sua's reaction was the first time Seorin saw the mask slip. "You," Sua said, cornering her in the garden one evening, voice trembling with something too sharp to be simple envy, "were raised in the servants' hall. You don't even know which fork to use for fish. And they hand you the crown prince like a she couldn't finish. She didn't need to." "I didn't ask for any of this," Seorin said quietly, and it was true, but truth has never once stopped resentment from taking root. What Seorin didn't see, what she wouldn't see until it was far, far too late, was the conversation that happened later that same night, behind the locked doors of Lady Myra's private study. Sua, red-eyed and furious, and Lady Myra, calm as still water, pouring her daughter tea with hands that did not shake. "She'll ruin everything," Sua had hissed. "Everything you built. Everyone will forget I'm the true heir. They'll forget you're the clan's principal." "I know," Lady Myra had said simply. "Then do something." Lady Myra had set down the teapot with a small, precise click. "I raised that girl for 14 years, fed her, clothed her, kept her alive when your father wanted her sent away entirely. Do you understand what that cost me? Every year she lived under this roof was a year I had to smile at women who whispered about the maid who spread her legs for a grieving lord. I did all of that so that if this day ever came, and I prayed to every ancestor that it never would, I would be the one holding the knife, not the one bleeding." It should be said plainly, for anyone watching a story like this and mistaking its shape, the tragedy of Seorin's life was not that her mother didn't love her. It is that her mother's capacity for love had been so thoroughly starved by years of shame and survival that by the time it mattered, there was nothing left to spend on a daughter who needed it. Cruelty rarely announces itself as cruelty. Far more often, it wears the exhausted, practical face of someone who has simply decided that their own survival matters more than yours, and has stopped noticing the difference between the two. "What do you mean to do?" Sua asked, quieter now. Lady Myra smiled the small, careful smile of a woman who had already begun planning. "Nothing yet. We wait for the right season to plant a seed, and when it grows into a weed no one can ignore, we simply let the family cut it down themselves." 2 floors above them, unaware, Seorin lay awake in her new silk sheets, hand pressed against her chest, memorizing the strange, unfamiliar shape of being wanted, never once suspecting that the same roof sheltering her happiness was already sheltering the plan to end it. The curse struck Suwa on a night in early autumn, 3 weeks before the royal betrothal ceremony that would formally bind Seorin to the crown prince before the entire court. It began as a fever. By midnight it had become convulsions, black veins crawling visibly up Suwa's throat while she screamed for a mother who was, conveniently, already at her bedside before anyone had thought to call her. By dawn, the estate's oldest healer confirmed what Lady Myra had in truth already known for days. This was no ordinary illness. This was blood magic, a curse woven from blood flame energy itself, the kind of power only a true Beak bloodline carrier could wield. There was only one other confirmed carrier in the house. I would never, Seorin said, standing in the doorway of her sister's sick room, staring at the black lines spreading beneath Suwa's skin with genuine horror. I don't even know how to do something like that. I only just learned to hold a training brazier without burning myself. Then perhaps, said Elder Hwang, the clan's severe-faced chief investigator, you'll explain how this was found beneath your bed. He held up a small clay talisman, blackened at the edges, carved with symbols Seorin had never seen in her life. A servant had discovered it that morning during a routine inspection. An inspection Seorin would later learn had been personally requested by Lady Myra the previous evening, hours before the talisman ever appeared. This is the part of the story that deserves to be said slowly, because it is the part most people recognize too late in their own lives. A lie only needs to be convenient. It does not need to be believable, not really. It needs only to arrive at the exact moment when the people around you are already frightened, already looking for someone to blame, already relieved to have a name to attach to their fear. Seorin had spent 14 years as an outsider in this house. The moment something went wrong, the household's instinct did not need to be argued into suspecting her. It simply needed permission. Lady Myra gave it with a single devastating sentence delivered in a trembling voice to the assembled elders. I found strange herbs in her room last month, she said, eyes wet, hand pressed to her chest as though the words cost her everything. Foreign herbs, the kind used in old blood rites. I told myself I was imagining things that my own daughter couldn't, she broke off, covering her mouth, the picture of a mother in agonized denial. She had planted no herbs. There were none, and there never would be any produced as evidence. A detail that would matter enormously later and mean nothing at all in the moment, because fear does not wait for proof. It waits for a story that fits the shape of what everyone already feared, that the miracle daughter, risen too far too fast, must have some darkness to explain it. Seorin looked at her mother across the sick room, searching her face for even a flicker of doubt, of hesitation, of the woman who had once touched her cheek and said, I saw. She found nothing. Lady Myra met her daughter's eyes without blinking, and in that unblinking calm Seorin finally understood, too late to matter, but not too late to remember, that this was not panic. This was performance. Her mother was not confused or frightened. Her mother was finishing something she had started long before the curse ever touched Suwa's skin. Confine her to the eastern wing, Lord Baek Junho said heavily, unable to look at either daughter, a man drowning in a decision he didn't want to make and would make anyway because it was easier than fighting for the truth. Until the healers determine whether Suwa will live. Seorin did not scream, did not fight the two guards who escorted her from the sick room. Some small, cold part of her, the same part that had learned at 6 years old to read the difference between a smile that reached the eyes and one that didn't, was already calculating, already understanding the architecture of what was happening around her. It was only once the guards shut the door of her new confinement, once she was finally, completely alone, that Seorin allowed herself to sink to the floor and whisper the question that would define the rest of her short life. Why, she asked the empty room, would she do this to me? She would not learn the full answer for 3 more days. By then, it would already be far too late to change what came next, though not, as it would turn out, too late to change everything that came after. The clan court convened 7 days later in the Hall of Ancestors, beneath 500 years of Beak portraits watching from the walls like silent, useless witnesses. Suwa had survived, though the healers warned the black veins might never fully fade from her throat. A permanent, visible wound that the household would forever point to as proof of the crime, regardless of who had actually committed it. She sat beside her mother in the front row, pale and trembling, playing the role of victim with a conviction that almost made Seorin believe her sister truly thought she was one. Almost. Seorin knelt in the center of the hall in the plain gray robe of the accused, wrists bound, flanked by 2 guards. Across from her, Elder Hwang presented the case with the flat, procedural cruelty of a man who had already decided the verdict and was merely performing the formality of a trial for the ancestors' sake. The talisman. The confession of jealousy Suah tearfully recounted, a conversation in the garden Seorin barely remembered, twisted now into something venomous it had never been. The simple, damning fact that Seorin was the only other person in the household capable of wielding blood flame magic. "I did not do this," Seorin said again and again, each repetition landing softer in the hall, swallowed by robes and disbelief and the particular silence of a room that has already made up its mind. "Test me, bring the priests. Let the flame itself judge whether I'm capable of this kind of magic. You all saw what it showed at my trial. Ask it now." It was, in fact, the single most damning request she could have made, though she didn't understand that until it was too late. Because it forced Lord Baek Junho, torn, exhausted, wanting more than anything for this entire nightmare to simply end, to turn to the one witness who could either save his illegitimate daughter or condemn her completely. He turned to Lady Myra. "You knew this child better than anyone," he said heavily. "You raised her, 14 years under one roof. Tell the Ancestors' Hall plainly, do you believe your daughter capable of this?" The Hall of Ancestors held its breath. Seorin lifted her bound wrist slightly, an instinctive, hopeless reach toward the one person whose word might still save her. The one relationship in this entire rotten house she'd never fully stopped hoping was real underneath all its coldness. 14 years of half-smiles and quiet distance, and still some foolish, stubborn part of her believed that when it truly mattered, blood would matter too. Lady Myra stood, smoothed her skirts, and looked at her daughter with an expression of such convincing, devastating sorrow that 3 elders in the front row would later swear under oath they'd seen genuine grief on her face. "I have asked myself the same question every night for a week," she said, voice breaking with practiced precision. "I raised her as my own. I wanted more than anything to say no, impossible, not my daughter." A pause calculated to the second. "But I cannot lie before the ancestors. I have seen a darkness in her since the night of her trial, an ambition I didn't recognize in the child I raised. I am her mother, and I am afraid of what she has become." Here is the lesson buried in the wreckage of that hall, the one worth carrying long after this story ends. Betrayal from a stranger is a wound. Betrayal from someone who is supposed to protect you is an earthquake. It doesn't just hurt you, it collapses the ground you thought you were standing on and forces you to question every memory you built your sense of safety upon. Seorin didn't cry out, she didn't argue. She simply went very, very still, the way a person goes still after being struck somewhere too deep for immediate pain, the true agony arriving only later in the silence after. "Mother," she said so quietly that only the front rows heard it. "Why?" Lady Myra did not answer the question in front of the hall, but her eyes, for one single unguarded second, told Seorin everything her mouth would never admit. "Because you were never supposed to outshine what I built with nothing. Because your miracle was my humiliation wearing a crown. Because some part of me has hated you since the day the flame chose you over the daughter I was supposed to have, and I would rather bury you than watch you replace everything I clawed together with my own 2 hands." Elder Hwang did not need further testimony. The clan council retired for less than an hour. Before returning with the verdict every person in that hall had already known was coming the moment Lady Myra sat back down. Death by the old right, stripped of rank, stripped of name, executed as a servant, the same status she'd been born into and had never truly been allowed to leave. Seorin was led from the Hall of Ancestors past 500 years of painted beak faces, none of them looking at her, all of them somehow still managing to judge her anyway. Behind her, she heard Suah's quiet, satisfied exhale. She heard, though she would spend the rest of her short life wishing she hadn't, her mother murmur something to the elder beside her, 3 words, almost too soft to catch, that Seorin would carry into her own execution 3 days later and beyond it, into whatever came next. Finally, it's done. She spent her final 3 days of life in a stone cell beneath the eastern wing, and it was there in that cold and total silence that Seorin finally allowed herself to feel the whole shape of what had happened to her. Not the trial. Not the talisman, the smile. She kept returning to it, the small, satisfied curl of her mother's mouth in the moment the verdict was read, a smile that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with relief. 14 years, Seorin thought, sitting in the dark with her knees pulled to her chest like the frightened child she'd once been. 14 years of half-warm rice and careful distance, and I told myself it was enough, because I didn't know what more looked like. And the whole time she was waiting, not for me to succeed, for me to become dangerous enough that she'd finally have permission to get rid of me. Older Nan came to her on the second night, bribing a guard with the last of her savings for 10 minutes alone in the cell. She held Seorin's hands through the bars, weeping in a way no one else in that entire household had bothered to. "I should have told you sooner," Nan whispered. I should have warned you the moment I saw how she looked at you after the trial. I thought surely no mother could." She couldn't finish the sentence. Some cruelties are too large for language, even from someone who witnessed them clearly. "It's not your fault," Seorin said and meant it. "You were the only kindness in this whole house. Don't let them make you believe kindness was the mistake." It is worth pausing here, in the coldest part of this story, to say plainly what Seorin herself only half understood in that cell. The people who fail us are rarely the villains of dramatic tales, twisting their hands in shadows. Far more often, they are simply people who chose comfort over courage, safety over truth, one small selfish decision at a time, until those decisions added up to something that looks from the outside exactly like cruelty. Because in the end, the effect on the victim is the same either way. Lady Myra likely never once in 14 years thought of herself as a monster. She thought of herself as a woman who had survived. That she survived by feeding her own daughter to the fire does not change what she believed about herself. It only proves how thoroughly a person can lie to themselves when the alternative is admitting what they've become. On the morning of her execution, snow fell for the first time that season, soft and strange and almost gentle, as if the sky wanted to offer her something beautiful before the end. They walked her out in the plain gray robe, hands bound, past a crowd that had gathered less out of grief and more out of the particular hunger people feel for watching a fall from grace. Suah stood near the front, veil lowered, unreadable. And Lady Myra sat wrapped in furs in the seat of honor reserved for grieving mothers and did not weep once. The hook of this story is the ending of this chapter. You already know the shape of it, the bound wrists, the smile. The final words, "Tell my mother I finally understand her and tell her I will remember." What you don't yet know is what happened in the half-second after the blade fell, in the space between one life ending and whatever came next beginning. Seorin had expected darkness. Instead, she opened her eyes in fire. Not pain, the blood flame itself, the ancient power that had chosen her that night 5 years ago, roaring up around her not as judgment this time, but as something closer to recognition. A voice moved through the flame, ancient and vast and somehow impossibly sad on her behalf. "Little heir," it said, in a language that was somehow also every language, 500 years I have slept in that house, waiting for a bloodline worthy of what I carry. You were the first in 3 centuries to burn bright enough to wake me, and I watched them murder you for it. Then why didn't you save me?" Seorin asked, and if a flame could feel the weight of a question, this one did. "Because power without wisdom simply repeats the same tragedy in a different shape," the voice answered. "You were 14 when I chose you, dazzled by scraps of love, starving for approval from people who would never truly give it to you. You would have burned the whole world down blindly and called it justice. I cannot give you back that life, but I can give you another, earlier, wiser, with everything you now know and nothing you didn't yet understand. What you build with it is yours to choose." Somewhere far above, in a world that had already buried her, snow was still falling on an empty grave. Somewhere else, 3 years in the past, in a body that had not yet stood before the blood flame trial. Had not yet learned to hope for a mother's love that would never come. A 14-year-old girl gasped awake in her bed, in the servants' hall, heart pounding, memories of an entire lifetime, and an entire betrayal burning behind her eyes. Seorin sat up slowly in the dark, pressed a hand to her own chest, and felt something inside her that had died on that execution ground settle instead into something colder, clearer, and infinitely more dangerous. She had exactly 1 year before the blood flame trial that would set everything in motion again. This time, she intended to be ready before the fire ever chose her name. The hardest part of waking up in the past was not the fear, it was the smile. 3 days after her second awakening, Lady Myra passed Seorin in the courtyard, and offered the same small, distracted nod she always had, the nod of a woman glancing at furniture she'd long since stopped truly seeing. Seorin felt her whole body go rigid with the memory of that same face, unblinking, calm, delivering the words that had ended her life. It took every ounce of the composure she'd built across an entire second lifetime of memory to simply nod back and keep walking, rather than screaming the truth into the courtyard for the whole household to hear. But screaming had never once worked in her favor. She had learned that lesson at the cost of her own life. This time she intended to learn from it instead of repeating it. Here is the first thing revenge fantasies rarely tell you honestly, and the first thing Seorin had to teach herself in those early weeks. Rage without a plan is simply a second, slower execution, this time performed by your own hand instead of someone else's. She spent the first month doing nothing that looked like revenge at all. She spent it watching. She watched Lady Myra's daily movements with new eyes, noticing for the first time things 14-year-old Seorin had been too starved for affection to see clearly. The way her mother's warmth always arrived precisely when witnesses were present and vanished the instant they left. She watched Sua's careless cruelty toward the household servants, filing away every small unkindness as evidence of a character the family's golden reputation had always conveniently ignored. She watched Elder Hwang, the investigator who would one day condemn her on manufactured evidence, and noted with cold clarity that he was not evil so much as lazy, a man who followed the path of least resistance, which meant he could be led later toward whichever conclusion was easiest to reach. Most importantly, she went to find older Nan. "Child," Nan said, nearly dropping her basket of linens when Seorin appeared in the servants' hall with an expression far too old for a 14-year-old's face. "What's happened to you? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I have," Seorin said quietly. "I've seen my own." She didn't tell Nan everything, not yet, not the full impossible truth of it, but she told her enough. That she believed with total certainty that people close to her intended her harm once her power was revealed, that she needed help preparing quietly without drawing attention. Nan, who had loved Seorin without condition or agenda for 14 years in her first life, did not ask for proof. She simply took Seorin's hands the way she had once done through prison bars in a future that would now, hopefully, never happen, and said the words Seorin needed most in that moment. "Then we'll be ready. Whatever's coming, you won't face it as alone as you think you are." It is worth sitting with this small moment, because it carries the true engine of every good revenge story, the thing that separates a satisfying reckoning from an empty, hollow one. Seorin's survival was never going to come from power alone. The Bloodflame had made that mistake clear enough in her first life. Dazzling power in the hands of someone still starving for love from people incapable of giving it. What would save her this time was something far rarer inside that cold house, one person who chose her freely without needing a miracle to justify the choice. Over the following months, Seorin built quietly. She used her second lifetime's knowledge of court politics, memories of conversations she'd been too young and too trusting to understand the first time around, to position herself carefully. She befriended a young guard named Yunti, a distant cousin of the clan assigned to the estate's outer walls, remembering that in her first life he'd been quietly dismissed on false charges months before her own trial. Another small cruelty she'd never had the perspective to notice at the time. This time she made certain he stayed employed, stayed loyal, stayed close. She began carefully to document things. A ledger of household expenses that didn't quite add up, hidden in Lady Myra's private study, evidence, she suspected, of debts her mother had never disclosed to Lord Baek Junho. Small inconsistencies in Elder Hwang's investigations of minor household disputes, patterns of favoritism she could use later to demonstrate exactly how easily his conclusions could be steered. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would draw suspicion. Just a 14-year-old girl quietly and patiently building the case that would one day save her life, and, if she was patient enough, dismantle every hand that had once helped end it. She had 8 months left before the Bloodflame trial. 8 months to become someone the fire would still choose, but someone the household could no longer destroy quite so easily once it did. What she didn't yet know, what she wouldn't discover until the very night of her second trial, was that Lady Myra's hatred had never truly been about ambition at all. It ran far deeper, into a secret Lady Myra had buried so completely that even she rarely let herself remember it. And when Seorin finally uncovered it, it would change the entire shape of the revenge she thought she'd already planned. The secret came to her, fittingly, through older Nan, the same woman whose quiet kindness had gone unnoticed by an entire household that prided itself on bloodline and status. "There's something you should know," Nan said one evening, nearly a year into Seorin's second life, her voice lowered even though they were alone in the herb garden behind the servants' hall. "Something I've carried a long time and never had reason to tell anyone until now." Nan had served the Baek household for over 30 years, long enough to remember Lady Myra not as the composed, calculating woman she'd become, but as a frightened 17-year-old maid, newly arrived from a farming village that had been wiped out by drought and debt the same year. Lady Myra, then simply called Myra, no title, no silk, had a younger sister. A sister who did not survive that first brutal winter in the capital, dying of a fever the family couldn't afford to treat, in a room barely larger than a closet, while Myra scrubbed floors 2 buildings away to earn the coin that arrived one day too late. "She told me once, years ago, in a rare, unguarded moment," Nan said. "She said she swore that night that she would never again let herself be powerless while someone she loved suffered for lack of status, lack of protection, lack of a name that meant something. She swore she'd claw her way to a position where no one could ever again let a person she was responsible for die simply because they didn't matter enough to the world. Seorin sat very still, feeling something complicated and unwelcome stir beneath her carefully built resolve, something dangerously close to understanding. "That's not an excuse for what she did to me," she said, and it wasn't a question. "No," Nan agreed. "It never could be. But it might be an explanation, and those aren't the same thing, however much they can feel like it in the moment. I think, and forgive an old woman for saying so plainly, I think your mother has spent 30 years so afraid of powerlessness that she forgot love and control are not the same thing. When you rose so fast, so far beyond anything she'd built for herself, some frightened, wounded part of her didn't see a daughter succeeding. She saw a threat to the only security she'd ever managed to build with her own two hands. And fear, left to rot long enough in a person, curdles into something that looks exactly like cruelty, even to the person carrying it. This is perhaps the sharpest lesson buried in the middle of this story, the one worth carrying long after the final section ends. Understanding why someone hurt you is not the same as forgiving them, and it is certainly not the same as allowing them to do it again. Seorin turned Nan's words over for days afterward, not because they softened her resolve, but because they sharpened it into something more precise than blind rage. Blind rage would have made her sloppy, would have made her, as the ancient flame warned, someone who burned the world down and called it justice. Understanding made her patient. It made her surgical. It let her aim not at destroying her mother out of raw hatred, but at dismantling the specific rotten architecture of fear and control her mother had built. The same architecture that would, unless someone stopped it, eventually consume Suwa too, and any child unlucky enough to be born beneath this roof after them. She began from that night forward to build her plan differently. Not a plan to simply survive the coming trial and let the family's schemes unravel around her by chance, the way they nearly hadn't the first time. A plan to force the truth into daylight so completely, so undeniably, that no elder, no counsel, no frightened father torn between two daughters could ever again choose comfortable silence over an uncomfortable truth. She needed three things before the trial arrived: proof of the ledger discrepancies that would reveal exactly how deep Lady Myra's hidden debts and secret arrangements truly ran; a witness inside the household whose loyalty could not be bought or frightened away. And she had that now in Yun-Ti, who had spent the past 8 months quietly rising in trust among the estate guards, positioned exactly where he'd need to be when it mattered. And one final piece she hadn't possessed in her first life at all: proof, gathered patiently and precisely, of exactly how a cursed talisman like the one that would be used to frame her could be manufactured, and by whom. It took her 4 more months to find that proof, tracing a supplier of rare blood ritual materials to a merchant Lady Myra had visited twice under a servant's disguise. Months before Sua's staged illness would even occur in the timeline Seorin now understood was already quietly beginning to repeat itself. She stood outside that merchant's shop on a cold evening, watching her mother's second disguised visit from across the street, and felt the full, terrible confirmation settle into her chest like a stone. It was happening again. The same plan, the same timeline, the same betrayal, moving forward exactly as it had before. Except this time, Seorin was no longer the 14-year-old girl who would spend her final days in a cell wondering why. This time she was already 3 steps ahead, standing in the shadows, watching the trap being built with her own name already written on it, and smiling very slightly for the first time in either of her 2 lives, with something that finally felt less like grief and more like control. The second Bloodflame trial unfolded exactly as Seorin remembered. The cold stone hall, the assembled elders, the collective held breath as she pressed her palm to the ancestral brazier, and the flame roared up gold, then white, then that impossible nameless color that made an 80-year-old priest weep for the second time in Seorin's memory, though he had no idea it was the second time at all. What was different this time was everything that happened after. Seorin did not run to her mother that night, hoping for a love she now understood would never come freely. She spent the evening instead in quiet conversation, with Yun-Ti confirming the final details of a plan 8 months in the making, while across the estate in a private study, Lady Myra poured her furious daughter tea with hands that this time Seorin already knew were about to begin planning a murder disguised as justice. 3 weeks later, precisely on schedule, Suwa fell ill with the same black-veined fever. Seorin felt a genuine, complicated pang of guilt as she watched her sister writhe in that same sickbed. Suwa, after all, was not truly the architect of this cruelty, merely its willing beneficiary, a girl raised her whole life to believe that Seorin's suffering was simply the acceptable cost of her own comfort. Guilt, Seorin reminded herself firmly, was not the same as innocence. Suwa had chosen every single time to look away from what was being done in her name, That choice had consequences too. The talisman appeared beneath Seorin's bed exactly as it had before. Discovered during a routine inspection that Elder Hwang would later, under very different circumstances, admit had been personally requested by Lady Myra the previous evening. A detail Seorin now had documented in writing in Yunti's careful hand witnessed and dated weeks before the talisman had even been planted. The Hall of Ancestors convened 7 days later, precisely as it had the first time, beneath the same 500 years of watching useless portraits. Seorin knelt in the same plain gray robe, wrists bound, and felt an eerie, vertiginous sense of living inside her own memory, until the moment Elder Hwang raised the talisman and Seorin calmly did something she had never once managed to do in her first life. She interrupted him. "Before this hall accepts that talisman as evidence," she said, voice steady in a way that made several elders sit up straighter, surprised by the composure of a girl they expected to be weeping and pleading, "I ask the court's permission to present evidence of my own." Lord Baek Junho, caught off guard, glanced toward Lady Myra before answering, a small, telling gesture Seorin filed away without reaction, and finally nodded, more out of confusion than genuine openness. What followed took less than 20 minutes and unmade 14 years of careful architecture in the process. Yunti testified first, presenting the dated, witnessed record of Lady Myra's inspection request, time-stamped a full day before the talisman's supposed discovery. Then came the merchant's ledger, quietly obtained through Nan's careful negotiations with a servant in the merchant's own household, documenting 2 visits from a disguised noblewoman purchasing precisely the rare materials required to construct a cursed talisman of exactly this design. Dated months before Sua's illness had even begun. And finally, Seorin produced the household account ledger itself, revealing years of quiet, undisclosed debts Lady Myra had accumulated and hidden from Lord Baek Junho entirely, debts that Seorin explained calmly to the stunned hall. Would have been catastrophically exposed the moment an illegitimate daughter with a miracle bloodline rose high enough in status to warrant closer scrutiny of the household's finances by the wider clan council. "My mother did not fear that I was dangerous," Seorin said into the ringing silence of the hall, looking directly at Lady Myra for the first time since the proceedings began. "She feared that I was honest. And an honest daughter rising in power was always going to eventually notice what a dishonest mother had spent 30 years hiding." Here is the lesson this story has been building toward from its very first sentence, the one worth carrying long after the final blade falls in any life. The truth, patiently gathered and carefully presented, is very often a far sharper weapon than rage ever could be. Rage can be dismissed as the desperate accusation of a condemned girl. Evidence, documented and witnessed and laid out with steady hands, cannot be dismissed nearly so easily, and it leaves the person wielding it standing afterward, instead of kneeling in the mud awaiting an executioner's blade. Lady Myra stood very slowly in the ringing silence of the Hall of Ancestors, and for the first time in either of Seorin's 2 lifetimes, her mother's composure finally, completely cracked. "You don't understand what I built," she said, voice shaking now, all performance gone. "Everything I have I built from nothing with my own hands because no one was ever going to protect me otherwise. I was not going to lose it. Not to a daughter who arrived by accident and stole what should have been mine to give, not to be taken. I never wanted to take anything from you," Seorin said quietly, and for one brief, aching moment, the 14-year-old girl who had once run through the rain with wild plum blossoms was visible again beneath the composed woman standing in her place. "I only ever wanted you to want me. That you couldn't give me even that, that's the only theft that happened in this hall, and it wasn't mine." The Hall of Ancestors did not move, did not breathe. 500 years of painted beak faces watching a truth finally arrive that none of them, in all their portraits and all their silence, had ever managed to force into daylight themselves. The council did not deliberate for even the full hour it had taken to condemn her the first time. Lady Myra was stripped of her title and her position within the household that same day, not executed, though several elders argued furiously for a punishment matching the one she had engineered for her own daughter. It was Seorin herself, to the visible shock of the entire hall, who spoke against it. "Execution would make this simple," she said. "It would let everyone in this hall go home tonight and sleep easily, telling themselves justice was served and the matter closed. I don't want it closed. I want it remembered. Exile her from the estate, strip her of rank and comfort, and let her spend whatever years remain to her understanding, in far smaller and far harder circumstances. Exactly what she once did to the daughter who never once stopped hoping she'd choose differently." It was not mercy, not entirely. Seorin understood with the clarity of someone who had already died once at this woman's hand that a clean execution would have been the easier gift, an ending sharp and final that asked nothing further of the person receiving it. Exile asked more. It asked Lady Myra to live, daily, inside the consequences of her own choices, stripped of every piece of status she had spent 30 years and one daughter's life acquiring. There is a particular kind of justice that understands this, that the people who hurt us out of fear rarely learn anything from a punishment that simply ends them. They learn, if they learn at all, from being forced to survive inside the wreckage they created. Sua's fate proved more complicated. She had not manufactured the talisman, had not visited the merchant, had not falsified the ledgers, but she had known on some level she would spend years unpacking honestly for the first time that her mother's schemes existed, and had chosen the comfort of not asking questions over the discomfort of confronting a truth that would have cost her everything she'd been raised to value. Seorin did not demand punishment for her sister. She demanded something harder, that Sua spend a full year working directly beneath the household servants, the same servants whose labor had supported every comfort Sua had never once questioned, not as punishment exactly, but as the education neither of them had ever received about what their family's comfort had actually cost the people beneath it. "You don't have to forgive me," Sua said quietly, on the night before her year of service began, finding Seorin alone in the garden where they'd once quarreled as girls who barely understood the forces already moving around them. "I wouldn't in your position." "I haven't decided whether I will," Seorin said honestly, "but I've decided I don't need to hate you to know you did wrong. Both of those things can be true at once. I spent a long time thinking revenge meant making everyone who hurt me feel exactly what I felt. I've come to believe it means something quieter than that, making sure they can never again do to someone else what they did to me." Lord Baek Junho, for his part, did not escape the reckoning either, though Seorin's judgment of her father proved the most complicated of all. He had not schemed, had not lied outright, but he had for 14 years, and then for a second lifetime she alone remembered. Chosen the comfort of not looking too closely at his own household, rather than the harder work of protecting the daughter everyone quietly agreed was easiest to sacrifice. "You could have asked harder questions," Seorin told him, the two of them alone in his study for the first genuinely honest conversation of either of her lives, at any point across 14 years. "You chose not to because the answers would have been inconvenient, and inconvenient truths have always been easier for this family to bury than to face." He had no defense for that, and to his credit he did not attempt one. What he offered instead haltingly, in the awkward language of a man who had never learned to apologize because no one in his own life had ever modeled it for him, was an acknowledgement, imperfect, incomplete, but real, that he intended to spend whatever years he had left trying to be a father worth the title, rather than simply a title worth inheriting. Crown Prince Taeyong, watching from the edges of a scandal that would have destroyed a lesser household entirely, sent word within days that his engagement to Seorin stood unchanged, along with a message that struck her more deeply than any grand declaration could have. "I did not choose to marry a miracle. I chose to marry the person who survived one, and I find I admire her considerably more than I ever admired the flame." Seorin stood in the weeks that followed as the closest thing to acknowledged heir the Baek clan had installed in 3 centuries, not through the flame's judgment alone this time, but through evidence, alliance, and a patience most people twice her age had never learned to practice. But there was one final piece of unfinished business, one conversation Seorin still owed herself before this chapter of her life could truly close. And it required traveling, alone, to the small border settlement where Lady Myra now lived out the first months of her exile. Lady Myra's new home was a single room above a dye shop in a border town 3 days' ride from the estate she had spent 30 years clawing her way into. Small, cold in the mornings, nothing like the silk and status she had sacrificed a daughter to protect. She looked older here, Seorin thought, standing in the doorway, not weaker, just finally fully visible, stripped of every performance that had once made her impossible to read. "I didn't expect you to come," Lady Myra said, not turning from the small window overlooking the dye shop's yard. "I didn't expect to either," Seorin admitted. "I told myself I was finished with you the day the council announced your exile, and then I kept finding I wasn't." Lady Myra finally turned. Whatever she'd expected to see in her daughter's face, triumph perhaps or cruelty, the mirror of what she herself might have felt in Seorin's position, she didn't find it. She found something quieter and in its own way far harder to sit with. Simple, exhausted honesty. "I know why you did it now," Seorin said. "Nan told me about your sister, about the winter you couldn't save her because you didn't have status or coin or a name that meant anything to the people who could have helped. I understand better than I did a year ago what 30 years of that fear does to a person. But you don't forgive me, Lady Myra said. It wasn't a question. No, Seorin said simply. Understanding isn't the same thing as forgiveness, and I won't pretend otherwise to make this easier for either of us. What I came to tell you is smaller than forgiveness, and I think, in its own way, harder to give. I came to tell you that I'm not going to spend the rest of my life the way you spent the last 30 years of yours. So afraid of being powerless again that I let the fear turn me into someone willing to destroy the people closest to me to protect what I've built. You taught me that lesson, even if you never meant to teach it. I intend to be the last person in this family who has to learn it the hard way. For the first time in either of Seorin's 2 lifetimes. She watched her mother's eyes fill with tears that were not performance not calculated for an audience of elders or a watching household. Tears that belonged finally only to the 2 of them in a small cold room above a dye shop, with nothing left to gain or protect. I am sorry, Lady Myra said, and the words came out rough, unpracticed, exactly as clumsy as 30 years of buried honesty should sound when it finally surfaces. Not because the council forced it, and not because it changes anything now. I'm sorry because somewhere in 30 years of surviving, I forgot that you were never the threat I decided you were. You were just my daughter. And I let fear convince me those were different things when they never had to be. Seorin did not embrace her. Did not promise a relationship that 30 years of fear and 1 execution could not simply be forgiven into existing. But she stayed a little longer than she'd planned to, and before she left she did something that surprised them both. She reached out and, for the first time since she was 6 years old, running through the rain with wild plum blossoms in her fist, let her mother hold her hand. It wasn't everything. It wasn't the love she'd spent an entire first lifetime starving for. But it was honest, and after everything, honest was worth more to Seorin now than any performance of love had ever been. She rode back to the Beak estate as the sun set over the border hills. Crown Prince Taeyong's letter folded carefully in her coat. Yoontae and Nan waiting for her at the gates, with the particular warmth of people who had chosen her freely without a flame or a bloodline ever forcing their hand. Behind her, the fire that had once condemned her and then, impossibly, given her a second chance to rewrite everything it had cost her, settled quietly into whatever waited for it next, its 500-year patience finally fully rewarded. Seorin had learned, across 2 lifetimes and 1 impossible second chance, the lesson this entire story had been built to teach. That revenge which only destroys leaves you standing alone in the wreckage of your own making, no better than the people who wronged you. But revenge that insists on truth, that demands accountability without losing itself to cruelty, that chooses to build something honest out of the ashes of every betrayal, that kind of revenge doesn't just punish the people who wronged you. It sets you free of them completely. And as the gates of the Beak estate rose to welcome her home for the second and final time, Seorin understood with total and hard-won certainty that she was no longer the daughter nobody wanted. She was the woman no one had ever managed to break.